The citation was taped to my front door with so much duct tape that it looked like someone was trying to keep evidence from escaping. $500 fine for excessive noise violation. Thursday, 3:17 a.m. The notice screamed in furious red letters, like it had been written in anger rather than ink. I stood there in my driveway, still holding my car keys fresh off the airport shuttle, wondering if my jet lag was making me hallucinate. Thursday, 3:17 in the morning. That couldn't be right. At that exact time, I'd been 30,000 feet above Kansas, flying home from a cybersecurity conference in Seattle. I had the boarding passes, my conference badge tucked in my laptop bag, and about 50 unread emails from the event to prove it. That's when it hit me. Margaret Whitmore had finally lost her mind. Margaret was the HOA president of Maple Ridge Estates, and ever since I'd moved in 8 months ago, she'd treated me like some kind of suburban contamination. Apparently, a 42-year-old divorced software engineer didn't fit into her perfect little vision of community values. Margaret ran the HOA like a private regime. She was 63, her gray hair molded into a helmet that looked ready for a wind tunnel, and she smiled with all the warmth of a parking ticket. She measured fence heights with a laser level. She once fined the Johnsons because their daughter's chalk drawings weren't approved outdoor art. She even counted the number of flowers in people's gardens to enforce her ridiculous, odd-number aesthetic rule, a policy she'd somehow passed in a late-night board meeting. Before ascending to her throne as HOA queen, Margaret had been a mid-level manager at a bank until multiple harassment complaints led to her quiet dismissal. After that, she redirected her obsession with control onto Maple Ridge Estates, turning a volunteer position into what she considered a full-time executive role. She even had business cards printed. Margaret Whitmore, President and Chief Compliance Officer, because apparently running an HOA was on par with running a Fortune 500 company. Her garage was converted into what she proudly called the HOA headquarters. Filing. Cabinets filled with violation histories lined the walls, and a whiteboard tracked every neighbor's infractions in color-coded markers. But Margaret's biggest crusade? Single men. She called us unattached males, claiming we attracted unsavory elements and damaged the family-friendly environment. According to her, we probably ran underground poker games or worse. My basement, however, held nothing more than a treadmill and dusty tax boxes, but good luck convincing Margaret of that. I walked inside and immediately began collecting evidence. My flight had left Seattle at 11:45 p.m. on Wednesday night. I'd been sitting in seat 12C, next to a chatty grandmother who spent the entire flight telling me about her grandson's little league stats. We landed at 6:20 a.m. Thursday. So, at 3:17 a.m., the exact time of the supposed noise violation, I was watching a flight attendant demonstrate how to buckle a seatbelt I'd already fastened 1,000 times. The longer I stood there, the angrier I got. This wasn't about the $500 fine. It was about Margaret's obsession with control. She had made it her mission to harass anyone who didn't fit her mold. Just last month, she'd tried to implement a dress code for checking the mail, claiming that men in basketball shorts were detrimental to children's moral development. The month before that, she proposed a curfew for single adults, saying we were more prone to late-night activities. She even suggested unmarried residents should pay higher HOA fees because we used more resources. She never could explain what those resources were. I pulled up my smart doorbell recordings. Wednesday night, nothing. No movement, no visitors, no lights. My motion sensors showed zero activity between 6 p.m., when my neighbor collected my mail, and 7 a.m., when the newspaper hit my driveway. Then I checked the backyard cameras. Same story. No movement, no noise, but then I saw something that made my jaw drop. At 3:05 a.m., my front camera caught Margaret herself creeping across my lawn, holding something in her hand. She stood near my living room window for about 4 minutes before hurrying away. At 3:15, there was a sudden burst of sound, heavy metal music, but it was clearly coming from outside the house. I zoomed in on the footage. The object in Margaret's hand? A large portable speaker, one of those waterproof ones people use for pool parties. She'd placed it right against my window, blasted music for exactly 2.5 minutes, then scurried off into the dark. The worst part? She looked directly at my camera at one point, completely unaware that it had night vision. Her face was perfectly visible, and she was wearing her official HOA president blazer, the same one she wore to every meeting, like she was conducting some kind of midnight inspection. That was it. I downloaded the footage to a flash drive and drove straight to the police station. Officer James Bradley watched the video with a raised eyebrow. "Yeah," he said, "you clearly weren't home. And this," he pointed to the footage, "this is concerning behavior. He agreed to accompany me to confront her." Margaret opened the door in that same blazer, navy blue with President Whitmore embroidered in gold thread. Her professional smile faltered the second she saw the officer beside me. She launched into her well-rehearsed HOA speech about maintaining standards and protecting property values. Her voice dripped, with that patronizing tone she used when lecturing about lawn heights. Officer Bradley calmly asked to see Thersiden's complaints she mentioned. Margaret's cheeks went pink as she admitted they'd been verbal complaints, that she hadn't documented properly. That's when I pulled out my phone and showed the footage of her sneaking across my lawn at 3:05 a.m. Her face drained of color. She stammered something about investigating suspicious activity. Officer Bradley pointed out that, according to her own citation, the noise didn't start until 3:17. Then I played the audio of the heavy metal music blasting from outside my house. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She insisted that someone else must have been in my yard. When I mentioned my other cameras showed nothing, she snapped that I must have tampered with the footage. Finally, Officer Bradley asked if she owned any portable speakers. First, she said no. Then she hesitated and admitted she had one for emergencies. Then, after another pause, she claimed it had been stolen. Last week, when Officer Bradley asked if she'd filed a police report for the supposed theft of her speaker, Margaret hesitated before claiming she'd been too busy with HOA duties. That's when she made her fatal mistake. She said that even if I hadn't been home, I was still responsible for my property and whoever might have been there. Then, without thinking, she added that she knew I'd been away at a conference. The air went still. I hadn't told her or anyone in the neighborhood where I'd gone. Her face flushed deep purple as she realized what she'd just confessed. She tried to recover, saying she'd merely assumed I was traveling because my car wasn't in the driveway. But when Officer Bradley calmly asked how she knew it was specifically a conference, Margaret's story started unraveling fast. First, she said she'd overheard it somewhere. Then it was a neighbor mentioned it at the grocery store. Finally, she insisted it was just a lucky guess, but it was too late. The damage was done. Officer Bradley's tone hardened. He informed her that filing false complaints was a criminal offense, and her pattern of behavior could easily qualify as harassment. That's when Margaret snapped. Her tight, practiced smile vanished, and the facade cracked wide open. She began ranting, saying single men ruin neighborhoods, that I probably threw wild parties when she wasn't watching, and that someone had to maintain order. I recorded everything. Every single word. The meltdown escalated when she blurted out that she'd been keeping an eye on my travel schedule through a friend who worked for the airline. That was the final nail in her coffin. Officer Bradley wrote up a full report and told her she could expect criminal charges for harassment, stalking, and filing false reports. Over the next 3 days, I started contacting my neighbors. The floodgates opened. David Park told me he'd been fined for a broken window while he was stationed overseas. The window never existed. The Andersons had been cited for cars that weren't even theirs. Jennifer Santos, another single resident, had received a violation for inappropriate curtains. Turns out, her curtains were identical to Margaret's own. Then came the worst story of all, from Robert and Susan Phillips, a sweet elderly couple who'd lived here for over 20 years. Margaret had fined them $800 for unsightly medical equipment on their porch. The equipment was Robert's wheelchair ramp. When they tried explaining it was medically necessary, Margaret told them that illness was no excuse for eyesores. She even suggested they move to an assisted living facility if they couldn't maintain community standards. Susan cried as she told me they'd paid the fine out of their fixed income, terrified that Margaret might have them evicted if they didn't comply. And then there was Marcus Thompson, a veteran and EMT who worked nights. Margaret had repeatedly fined him for parking his own car in his own driveway during the day, claiming it violated the spirit of residential parking rules because most people were at work. She even tried to pass a rule requiring all vehicles to be gone between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., essentially banning night shift workers from living there at all. That's when we realized it wasn't just harassment. It was a full-blown abuse of power. 14 of us banded together and hired an attorney named William Haworth, a specialist in HOA law. After reviewing our evidence, William actually laughed, then said, "This is one of the worst cases of HOA misconduct I've ever seen." He filed for an emergency HOA meeting, scheduled for Tuesday night. Margaret tried to spin it by sending out a newsletter accusing troublemakers of trying to destroy community values. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it anymore. When the night came, the community center was packed to capacity. Margaret sat at the head of the table, gripping her gavel like a weapon, her knuckles white. She opened with a long, self-righteous speech about the burden of leadership and how some people don't appreciate sacrifice. Then William stood up, calm, confident, and holding a stack of evidence 2 inches thick. He started reading, 23 false complaints in 18 months, a clear pattern of discrimination against unmarried residents. Over $16,000 in fees era missing from the HOA's official books. The room erupted. People shouted questions, demanding to know where their money had gone. Someone yelled that Margaret's nephew had been paid $40,000 for pool maintenance. Except, our neighborhood didn't have a pool. Another neighbor said they'd seen HOA-purchased plants in Margaret's personal garden. Margaret slammed her gavel so hard, the handle snapped in 2. She shrieked that everyone would be fined for causing a disturbance. That's when I stood up and played the recording. Her voice, crystal clear, was ranting about single men. Her confession about monitoring my travel schedule through an airline friend. The room went silent except for her voice echoing from the speakers. The board didn't hesitate. They called for an immediate vote to remove her. Margaret screamed that the vote was illegal, but William calmly pointed out that the bylaws allowed emergency removal in cases of criminal conduct. The vote came in, 58-2. Only Margaret and her loyal friend, Eleanor, voted in her favor. Margaret tried to save face by claiming she was resigning anyway, but the board insisted on an official removal. Within a week, the district attorney filed 18 counts of filing false reports, each carrying fines and potential jail time. Our civil lawsuit, filed by 14 families, sought over $400,000 in damages. Then the state investigators stepped in. They discovered Margaret had embezzled $43,000 in HOA funds over 2 years. At her criminal trial, her lawyer argued she suffered from a psychological condition that made her obsessed with control. But the prosecutor tore that apart by showing emails where Margaret bragged to her sister about running out the undesirables and making a tidy profit doing it. The real bombshell came when the forensic team recovered her deleted personal journal. In it, she detailed her twisted purification plan for Maple Ridge Estates, writing that single men were perverts, single women were loose, and renters were temporary trash. She rated each false complaint like Yelp reviews. Noise violation, 4 out of 5 stars. Should have made it drugs instead. Harder to disprove. Worse still, the investigation revealed Margaret had been funneling 30% of every fine into a hidden account through her nephew's fake maintenance company. Over $60,000 total, money she'd used for vacations, jewelry, and her own mortgage. In the end, the judge found her guilty on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to 3 years in prison with 18 months to serve, 5 years of probation and full restitution. The fines totaled $36,000. and the civil judgment added another $220,000. But the judge wasn't done. He issued a lifetime ban, preventing her from ever serving on an HOA board again. He also ordered 500 hours of community service, ironically helping single-parent households. And when the real estate board reviewed her conviction, they revoked her license for good. When the sentence was read, Margaret just stood there, frozen. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then she collapsed into her chair, sobbing that she'd only been trying to keep the neighborhood safe. As the bailiff cuffed her and led her away, the room stayed silent. Her perfect gray helmet of hair fell across her face, and for the first time she didn't look powerful, just small, broken, and every bit of her 63 years showing.